So, Kyriakos, we'll try to demonstrate our collective intelligence up here.
Collective intelligence of two.
That's right. Thank you, Lex. I do sense an air of new optimism here in Athens. But before we get to that, how did Greek democracy actually survive the last several years? There hasn't been a recession like the Greek outside wartime, perhaps ever, certainly in a very long time. But soaring unemployment, the rise for a while of a far-rightist group, Golden Dawn, a feeling of collapse. And yet, Greek democracy did, in the end, show great resilience. And here we are. So why did Greece just not fall off the cliff?
Obviously because we demonstrated collective intelligence at the ballot box. But I think you're right to point out that Greece went through the most severe crisis ever faced by any mature democracy after the Second World War. Our institutions were challenged. Populism was on the rise. We were the first to actually elect a populist party of the left into power. One should not forget that Syriza governed by forming an alliance with the populists of the right. Thank God they adjusted to reality, but with a significant delay and with significant cost to the economy. And I think what happened in this process was an exercise by which Greek society matured significantly, realized that populists, when they come to power, don't offer any real solutions to real problems. And there was I would argue, a collective readjustment where Greek society essentially opted for a party which was considered to be part of the old establishment, but which they saw had changed enough to give it a chance to govern. So I would argue that Greece was, as you wrote once, we were first in this populist wave. We're possibly the first to have entered what I call the politics of post-populism. But what I find interesting was that this was not a top-down exercise. It was very much an exercise where our political narrative found common ground with society, which matured bottom up
in the process.
In that sense, those who predicted the demise of democracy
proved wrong.
Were wrong, as far as Greece at least is.
Do you think membership of the European Union, Kyriakos, provided an essential framework? I mean, everybody loves to attack the EU, everybody loves to attack Brussels. I think it's the greatest post-war miracle that brought stability and prosperity to this continent. Without that framework of the EU, do you think the danger for Greece would have been greater?
Of course. We came very close to actually crashing out of the Eurozone and possibly
Well, actually, the Greek people voted, in effect, to leave the euro in 2015.
I'm not sure the Greek people realized exactly what they voted for.
And
certainly, what was interesting was that an exercise, if we consider public participation to be expressed through referenda, and we give the people the power to express themselves outside the context of an election, then this was essentially a big fraud. Because what happened was a referendum with a specific question that was only reversed a week later.
But wasn't that anti-democratic for then Prime Minister Tsipras to go to the Greek people, which I think is what Lex was suggesting we do more, consult them, hear their collective intelligence, which was get us out of this austerity program, in effect, and then ignore it.
There was essentially, it's always, all referenda tend to, no is always more appealing than yes.
Right.
So essentially it's always a good advice for how to phrase questions in referenda. I am rather skeptical about referenda in general, and I continue to be a believer in representative democracy. That does not mean that we should not find new ways of making sure that we have civic engagement, but representative democracy is the norm. I'm a student of Athenian democracy, but we need to acknowledge that it happened in a very, very limited context in terms of the numbers who actually participated. And I'm a believer that parties, which are the mechanism through which representative democracy is expressed, can actually change. They can become more participatory, they can become more open, they can engage in more public debates, but at the end of the day, the important decisions, for the foreseeable future at least, will be taken by representative governments, and we have to make sure that these representative governments are not only representing the interests of a very narrow group of elites who end up working in their own interest. And sometimes it's up to us. You know, I hear this, this debate about, elites quite frequently, and I would argue provocatively that I'm a poster boy for an elite.
Well, Harvard, Stanford,
coming from a political family, but yeah. I made a public case that a party cannot only represent elites, it needs to open up, it needs to bring in new blood, it needs to be much more democratic in the way it takes decisions. And at the end of the day, when we look at the people who actually decide on behalf of the people, they need to be a representative cross-segment of society and not just representing special interest groups. Because what happened in Greece, and the root cause of the crisis, was that the political system was taken over by specific interest groups. And at the end of the day, those interest groups, be it business, trade unions, a segment of public sector employees, legislated and took political decisions that only served their own interests. So once we convinced, I think, people that we can actually break that mold, that we're here for everyone, that the challenge is really inclusive growth, that the root cause of Greek discontent was not the nativist identity politics that you see in other countries, but a profound economic crisis. Once we convinced people that we're here to work for everyone, and in particular for those who are less privileged, and we made income disparity and addressing it our number one priority, we managed to convince enough people to give us a chance to implement our program.
But do you think the failure of Western democracies during this century up to now, and the reason behind the populist movements that we've seen growing everywhere, nativist, nationalist, xenophobic, has been the failure in general of the privileged to understand the have-nots, to understand those who felt ignored, who felt invisible, who felt alienated by the ideas in the big cities, and so on? And do you think, as a product of an elite, that you can make that imaginative leap to comprehend?
But you have to. Sometimes you're asked, how do you understand, how do you comprehend what it means for someone to live with 500 euros a month?
Can you, personally?
You have to.
Kyriakos Mitsotakis,
you have to do the best that you can to put yourself as much as you can intellectually in that position. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there was a massive failure of elites to understand the new cleavages that emerged as a result of technological change, of globalization, the massive impact of income concentration, especially in capitalist societies, especially the US. The fact that lots of people just felt left behind, that there is a cleavage between cities and rural and the backcountry, that there's a cleavage between young people who are more modern, more secular, and old people who are more traditional. Elites failed to understand that the grievances upon which the populist backlash was based were absolutely real. They were really, they were arrogant in terms of believing that these were not very real and very complex problems. And we have to take a lesson from the failures that resulted in this populist backlash. Again, I focus more on these aspects than the more sort of identity-driven component of populism, simply because our experience in Greece is not that much related to that component as it is to the problem of going through a profound economic crisis.
Britain has had a lot of those problems, and they culminated with the Brexit decision and the agony that has followed, protracted, seemingly unending agony. Do you think Britain should take a leaf from the Greek book and do a kolotumba, as it's called here, a somersault, and simply change its mind or ignore the vote? Or do you think the Greek example would actually serve Britain?
I do think, and I probably shouldn't make too many comments in public about this.
Well, go ahead.
But I do think there are some interesting similarities between what happened in Greece in 2015 and what is happening in Britain today. Although I think the problem becomes actually pronounced when you have a society that is so divided on an existential problem. And there's also an additional problem that, when parties are divided between them, and there is no real political alignment in support of very specific views, then it makes the situation that more complicated, because an election doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Sure.
If in Greece if in the UK you had a Brexit party and a Remain party, and they would have to fight it out, then an election would solve the problem. But the dividing lines between the parties are much more complicated.
But you would like to see Britain remain in the EU, right?
Look, I've said publicly that I think the Brexit decision is a decision that is going to cause more problems to the UK than it will for Europe. It's a lose-lose proposition, but the UK is going to be the bigger loser in this context. At the same time, I've also said that we have a deal currently on the table. It has an important component, which is the Irish backstop. I don't see enough progress being made in terms of the UK offering credible alternatives, and I think we're in for very interesting and certainly turbulent 3 weeks at the European level, where at the next Council these issues will be discussed. There are also other elements where I found your presentation very interesting, which we sometimes overlook in terms of how political systems actually adjust to the will of the people. One of them, which I don't think gets enough attention from political analysts, is the actual importance of electoral systems. You have 3 different types of electoral systems. You have first past the post, like is happening in the UK, where you could end up with an overwhelming parliamentary majority if you simply get 40% of the vote and end up with 70 or 80% of the seats. You have straightforward proportional representation, and we have what we have in Greece, which is an enhanced proportional representation, which is still representative enough, but gives the leading party the possibility to form a government on its own, thus ensuring at least political stability and not making smaller parties veto players, and when you have the constant problem of engaging in coalition building, where at the end of the day you have the least common denominator and no action taken by government. So I must say, obviously, I'm a big believer in this system. I think that if a party gets 40% in the ballot box, it deserves to govern with an absolute majority. And
or you can have 90,000 Tories installing a prime minister, as is the case with Boris Johnson. But speaking of action, Elizabeth Warren has a plan for everything. You also have a lot of plans. It's still, I think, the economy is stupid here in Greece. The economy did begin to grow again in 2016, but unemployment is still at 17%. The banks still have a lot of problems. Youth unemployment, I think, is at double that. I saw an estimate in The Economist that still only half of Greeks are paying any income tax. So the problems remain. How are you going to jolt Greece into real strong economic growth and maintain this spirit of optimism, at least for a while?
First of all, let's acknowledge that something has really changed in Greek society after the July 7th election. There is a general sense of optimism, a belief that we're finally leaving the crisis behind. It is reflected in all economic indicators. If you look at investor sentiment, it is moving upwards in a very, very impressive manner, unlike what is happening in other countries, for example, Germany. So there is a belief that we can make a new start, and we've made it very clear that we want to use the first 6 months of this government to implement real change and to send a clear signal that we've broken out of this vicious cycle which has essentially held us behind for a decade. How do you do that? Three important components. You change your fiscal policy. You start putting in place tax cuts for everyone, not just for the few. I'm a big believer that in an economy that has still significant levels of tax evasion, if you reduce the tax burden, you will also improve tax compliance, and I think we have enough evidence that this is beginning to.
So you've cut taxes for corporations, for
individuals? We first started, which was interesting, we first started by cutting taxes in real estate. There was some skepticism initially. Why do we actually do that? The argument was relatively simple. First of all, it affects everyone. I have great respect for President Macron. We have a very good personal relationship. But I always took notice of the fact that his first tax cut was the wealth tax for the rich.
You think that was a mistake?
I think it was a political mistake. And there's always this aspect that there is this belief that there is a trickle-down effect, but it does take time. Our tax cut was a tax cut, horizontal tax cut for everyone, and we actually gave bigger tax breaks to the lower income households. So we send a clear signal. When we cut taxes, we do it for everyone. And the weakest households actually benefit the most. This is an economy that is driven to a certain extent by real estate. Once real estate prices start going up, as they have, these are long-term trends, it helps the banks, which have lots of real estate in terms of their collateral. It helps the whole construction business. So this is not just a measure that supports the disposable income of households, it's also a growth generating measure. We're cutting taxes on corporations. We're cutting personal income taxes. We're cutting taxes on dividends. We are streamlining spending. And we've said very clearly that obviously we will meet and possibly exceed our fiscal target for 2019. That was not a given when we took over. I need to remind our audience that when we took over, there was a fiscal gap for 2019. Now, if anything, there will be an additional surplus, and we will contemplate how we will use it. If there is an additional fiscal surplus by December, it will be used again to support the weakest. We've said for 2020 that we can meet the 3.5% target, and the budget we're submitting is targeting towards that goal. But we've
3.5% budget surplus.
Yeah, but we've also said that in 2020 we want to have an honest discussion with our creditors about starting to lower these very high primary surplus targets. We've discussed this at length. They don't make any economic sense. They were put in place at a time when interest rates were higher. I need to point out that the first time in the history of the Hellenic Republic, we borrowed at negative interest rates yesterday. That was inconceivable even a year ago. It happened. It's a vote of confidence in the new government.
So people are giving you money for a negative interest rate?
People are paying, even if it's a small amount.
So Greece is back?
Greece is back. There's no doubt about it. Not only is it back,
but don't people look at the old airport, that vast piece of real estate, speaking of real estate, it's just sitting there, and, a decade or so after plans were first drawn up, nothing has happened, and people think, Greek red tape, Greek obstacles, there's always some issue. And how do you get over that kind of sense of Greek inertia?
Well, that's why we use the Greek airport as an example, that things can get done. What did we do with the Greek airport? The Hellenic airport? We inherited a very complicated situation. We made a commitment that in 2 months we will issue 4 ministerial decrees regarding essentially zoning that will unblock the project. We did it. We stuck to our timetable. We said that we would hold the new casino tender. We had a slippage of 4 days. We had set a deadline of September 30th. We had to push it to October 4th, but we have 2 bids now for the new casino operator, 2 U.S. companies, reputable, that are participating in the tender. The project manager is launching a 650 million euros rights issue to finance the project. Lots of interest in participation. The project will begin in 2020. So we've proven to people that things actually can get done if there is political will and basic competence in terms of addressing these issues. None of these were present in the past.
But Kyriakos, one day, it's inevitable in democratic politics, the honeymoon will end. The honeymoon will be over and you'll be sitting there. And when it does, what will you say to the Greek people? How will you persuade the Greek people to persist on the path that you've set out?
I think, frankly, I think there never was really a honeymoon.
There is a honeymoon right now.
I'll tell you why.
It's the first 100 days. Everybody's feeling good about you.
Yeah, well, why are they feeling good? They're feeling good because we've exceeded expectations.
Yeah.
Had we not exceeded expectations, there would not have been a honeymoon. It's very
People
simple.
were feeling good about Emmanuel Macron after 100 days.
That is true. Although I'm slightly more optimistic because they're actually feeling better about us now than they did when they first elected us into power.
Right.
What I'm saying, you're absolutely right. And
are you saying the honeymoon will not end?
I'm saying that all honeymoons end.
Yeah.
I am saying that that this honeymoon, unlike previous ones, is more of a rational honeymoon than an emotional.
A rational honeymoon. That sounds a little. That sounds a little.
Honeymoons can actually last longer.
That is why I'm making that.
Rational honeymoons are better because when you have big. I should remind our audience that
you're not a romantic.
When Mr. Tsipras was elected in February of 2015, he had much higher approval ratings than I have now. And then it all crashed.
Yeah.
So I'm fully aware of the fact that you cannot fight events. Right. Events always, can take over your agenda. What I'm saying is we have a plan. We're sticking to the plan. People are happy that we're sticking to the plan. People tell us, we're happy that you're actually doing what you told us you would be doing. I've been very open to say that when we make mistakes, we'll tell people, we set annual targets. I went to Thessaloniki, which is our annual State of the Union speech. I said, look, I'm going to change the format. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do next year. I'm going to come in a year's time. I'll tell you what we did. I'll give explanations where we failed, and I'll set the targets for the next year. I'm fully aware of the fact that this feel-good factor is not going to last for long, but we might as well take good advantage of it.
But you're saying rational honeymoons are longer honeymoons.
They are longer honeymoons because they're based on the belief that actually something can really change for everyday people. This is not just a question of people liking me or my government because we may be good orators, or we may be speaking well to the public, or we may use spin. I think one of the lessons from social media and from citizen participation, coming back to the point of the previous very interesting presentation, in my mind there is very little room for spin these days. People will see through whatever you try to spin if it flies in the face of reality. And they'll get even angrier. You can use social media to get their views, to engage with them, to communicate what it is that you're doing. But if you try to spin a fake reality, at least in a country such as Greece, which has gone through all sorts of political experiments, people will see through it immediately. So to come back to your question, when I first took over, everybody was telling me, make good use, you got to move quickly.
Yeah.
And then I looked at other political examples and I said, well, nobody seems to do that. And then they say, why didn't we move quickly enough? So I said, we will move quickly. We will use our honeymoon for what it's worth, and we will try to create the positive economic momentum in order to focus on the more long-term reforms that essentially need much more time to explain to people and to implement. But if we don't break out of the vicious cycle, if we don't bring down unemployment, if we don't increase disposable income, if we don't push growth to 3%, which is our target, all the rest of the discussion is not going to be that relevant.
Kyriakos, you're young and dynamic. You're 51. When you look at the United States and you see all these candidates well into their 70s, or at least into their 70s, does that worry you?
Well, you have a very interesting democratic process in the U.S., which we are following very closely, trying to always, make sense of what is happening.
You've just been in the U.S. You met here with Secretary Pompeo.
For us, this is the relation between the U.S. and Greece is a strategic relation, and we have to look beyond, who's occupying the offices as we speak, which is the same actually for Greece. When we sign a new defense and cooperation agreement with the U.S., which is a long-term agreement, this agreement will last for many years to come, as did the previous one. The previous one was actually signed back in the early 90s, so when somebody else was prime minister. What we want is an institutional cooperation with the U.S. We value this relationship particularly. We think it's a win-win relationship. We think that Greece is the only credible pillar of stability in a very uncertain part of the world. And we don't comment about what is happening in U.S. domestic politics.
Well, let me invite you to comment a little bit, because when you look at the United States today, the underwriter of the post-war free world, standing up for freedom, rule of law, democracy, and you see an American society as torn as it is today, with really open war right now between the Congress, which has begun an impeachment inquiry, and President Trump and the White House essentially dismissing this and refusing to cooperate with it. And you see the fissures in American society. Are you worried? Are you worried that the United States as beacon is a thing of the past?
I am worried. First of all, I'm worried on two issues. First of all, I'm worried that the fabric of the post-World War II arrangement, security and economic cooperation framework that led to the world to the greatest levels of prosperity it has ever seen, is under attack. And that is problematic. And
is it under attack, or has it been outgrown?
I don't think it has been outgrown. If anything, I think it's much more, given the fact that you have other powers rising that don't necessarily believe in free sort of liberal democracies, or I think it is much more relevant today. I'll be very blunt. The alliance between the U.S. and Europe is more important today than it was maybe 20 years ago. So I do believe that this is important. The second area of great concern is climate change.
But just on that for a moment, President Trump has attacked NATO, has favored the British exit from the EU, seems to favor the fragmentation of the European Union. So how can the transatlantic relationship survive a president who seems to be opposed to it?
Because I think these ties, which are deep cultural and institutional ties, go beyond any particular president, prime minister. I think they're much deeper, and I've openly expressed my disagreement with these policies. I think the European Union, for all its shortcomings, has been a unique experiment in collective transnational cooperation, which has brought great wealth and prosperity to our continent. I think those who were quick to hope on the demise of the European Union were proven wrong, and I will do my best to make sure that they are proven wrong in the future. And I do hope that, as far as U.S. society is concerned, that some of the main challenges that we are facing, most important one being climate change, that there is a bottom-up awareness of the fact that this is an absolutely critical challenge that cannot be solved without U.S. leadership.
Have you taken strong action on climate change in the last 100 days?
We've taken very strong action on climate change, the most important one being that we have announced that we will shut down all our lignite plants by 2028, which is the boldest decision taken by any European government that is actually a lignite-producing government.
And lignite currently produces how much of your energy?
Almost 50% of our energy. So
so how will you replace it?
Natural gas as a transition fuel, and of course a much greater penetration of renewables. So we are moving away from lignite. I've said so clearly. I made my commitment at the UN. We have very old lignite plants. They are uneconomical, and if you factor in the price of CO2. But I will also at the same time be at the forefront of what we call the just transition mechanism that the European Union is putting in place. We have one region, Western Macedonia, which is very dependent on lignite, and I want to make this the case study in Europe for how you move away from lignite into more sustainable forms of investment. We've also said that we want to ban single-use plastics by 2021, by the end of 2021.
Well, you should come to a US supermarket and make a stand.
But what I'm saying is that there are areas where Greece can actually play a global leadership role in the sustainability fight. And what I'm also saying is that when you look at the cleavages in Greek society, we do not have a Green Party in Greece. I intend to take over as a moderate center-right party. I intend to take over the mantle of the reasonable and realistic environmentalist. I find it very funny that our political opponents suddenly discover the green agenda, but they're still filling Athens with nice little posters every time Mr. Tsipras has to give a speech. It doesn't seem very
But Kyriakos, you never put up any posters?
None. We never put out. We said very clearly because we never put out any posters during our campaign. None. Zero.
Wow.
We refused from using posters. Wow. So we try to stick to our.
Do you still read the physical New York Times, or you disapprove of that?
No, I read the digital edition on my iPad. Although I do occasionally enjoy paper, I'm still struggling as to whether I should shift to ebooks.
Yeah.
I do. To be very honest with you, I do both.
Right.
I love the fact that I can underline on ebooks and then extract what I think is interesting.
Kyriakos, let's talk Turkey for a moment. You met with President Erdogan in New York, but what Turkey's doing with regard to Greece is pretty aggressive. These overflights, Cyprus, the offshore drilling in waters, in Cypriot waters, and do you feel threatened by Turkey? Do you feel that the relations between Greece and Turkey right now are at their most dangerous point in a long time?
We feel very confident that we can deal with Turkey because we have strong allies and we have great belief in our foreign policy. I've tried to, and I will always try to engage with President Erdogan. And I told him that it would be in the interest of both our countries if we try to make a restart in Greek-Turkish relations. But of course, it needs two to do that. I've made it very, very clear.
What did he say to you?
I made it very clear. I'll tell you what I said because it was still a private meeting. I made it very clear that using the refugee and migrant crisis as a lever to put pressure on Europe is not the appropriate strategy.
Because several thousand of refugees have arrived recently in Greece.
And
so he opened the spigot, basically.
There's no doubt that the refugee issue was used to put pressure on Europe.
Yeah.
Europe should continue to support Turkey financially to deal with the refugee crisis. At the same time, it needs to take a stance, very clear stance. I've been very open in terms of what's happening, not just in the Aegean with the overflights, but in Cyprus, where you have a clear violation of Cypriot sovereign rights, which cannot leave the European Union without some reaction. And I consider that a reaction will, you will see a reaction relatively soon. And of course, we have the additional problem now of the activity in Syria. Any unilateral.
What do you think of the Turkish armed forces moving?
I think it's plainly wrong.
You think it's plainly wrong?
Yeah, any unilateral intervention in an unstable country without any, without the support of the United Nations that will at the same time give rise to extreme terrorism is clearly the wrong strategy.
But it appeared to be green-lighted by President Trump.
Well,
against the Kurds, who had been the United States' most effective ally against ISIS.
The official statements that I read, that I read and that I saw from Secretary Pompeo, I stand by and I hope that this is also the official policy of the U.S. is that no green light was given for this invasion. It adds another source of instability in an already very unstable part of the world.
Do you think Turkey is drifting into Putin's camp?
I think that there is an interest in keeping Turkey anchored to Europe. It is the long-term interest of everyone to do that. It's in the interest of the Turkish economy. It's in the interest of Turkish society, which is also under pressure. But Turkey is a difficult customer that doesn't play by the rules. And we made it very clear that the rules are the rules of international law. I was in Egypt 3-4 days ago, and we have a new framework of trilateral cooperation between Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and a general belief that if we want to take advantage, for example, of hydrocarbon exploration in the region, we need a framework of cooperation, and we first of all need to agree, who owns what. And what belongs to Cyprus belongs to Cyprus. It belongs to its exclusive economic zone.
It doesn't belong to Turkey.
It doesn't belong to Turkey. You can't just say, show up with a drill ship and say this is mine, simply because you don't recognize.
It's a little bit what China has been doing in the South China Sea, and you referred to rising powers that do not share our democratic beliefs. China, I think, owns substantially, anyway, the port of Piraeus. What is your view of China's rise and President Xi's more autocratic turn, Belt and Road, Chinese assertiveness, Chinese expansion? Does it worry you? I'm going to turn this open in a minute, so if you have any questions, please bear them.
Well, as far as China is a big investor in Greece, they've invested in the port of Piraeus. It has been overall a successful investment. It is an investment that follows very specific rules. We encouraged it. When we had issues with the Chinese related to an additional expansion they were requesting, we consulted with the local communities and we said we're not ready to approve that. We're not saying we're not going to do it, but we're not ready to move in that direction. So it's not that we're open for business, but within a specific rules framework. And I think that overall this investment was good for the Greek economy. It has upgraded the port. It has created lots of new jobs. At the same time, we want to encourage foreign investment from everywhere, and we don't want to be too dependent on any particular foreign power. We also welcome U.S. investment in Greece, and while we're happy that we have two companies interested in the Hellenic project.
But more broadly, President Xi is building, it seems, a surveillance state in China. How worrying for advocates of democracy around the world is that?
I think in general, the idea that we can have algorithm and smart systems controlling our everyday life is extremely worrying. And the
technology is there to do that.
The whole concept, but that is why Europe has been at the forefront of data protection in the world. And that is why we take data protection also in Greece very seriously. And I think Europe can be a model of how you build a democracy which protects your data rights, which are becoming more and more important in this digital world as a currency by big tech companies. That is why Europe has taken leadership in terms of regulating U.S. tech companies, and I think it was right to move in that direction. That's why I'm still, in spite of all the skepticism, about the European Union, I think we're at the forefront of a lot of very important public policy debates that will, shape the future of the world for the next decades.
Finally, just talk to me a moment about Greek humanity. I was very struck on Lesbos at the height of the crisis, the way refugees were received. Other European countries, some of which, like Poland or Hungary, basically have no immigrants, utterly opposed to receiving any refugees. What is it about Greece that even in the midst of deep crisis resists the transactional nature of modern society and retains the ability to look a human being in the eye, realize that human being has certain basic rights, including the right to human dignity, and has proved receptive and open to that. Why has this Greek humanity been so resilient through such hardship?
Well, maybe that's who we are, and I'm proud of that. We've proven that we are particularly sensitive to human hardship, and we've demonstrated it time and time again. At the same time, I'll be very, very honest with you, this should not be perceived as a weakness of the Greek state to protect its own territory. We basically send a signal over the past years that the easiest way into Europe, not into Greece, is through Greece. So of course we will take care of a shipwreck if it takes place in the Aegean. That doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation towards our citizens to manage what is no longer a refugee problem, but primarily an economic migration problem in a much more effective manner. And I think Greece is an ethnically homogeneous society, but it is also gradually changing, and we do have, as I said in Parliament a few days ago, we do have the capacity to integrate refugees in our society. We've done it before successfully. I feel frustrated when I see European countries who want to benefit from the European Union in terms of, for example, participating in the Schengen zone, who tell us, well, we have no obligation not to accept a single refugee.
Isn't that outrageous?
It is outrageous, and it's no longer going to be tolerated. I can tell you that. For example, we tried, because there's a lot of hypocrisy here. The most sensitive aspect of the migration problem has to do with kids and with unaccompanied minors. And we take care of thousands of them. And we tried to find a framework of cooperation by which we told, our European friends, we have 3,000 unaccompanied children, essentially. Let's find a way to send them to all European countries. What would happen to Poland if they accepted 100 unaccompanied minors? Nothing. And still, there is a general sort of rejection that we want to be part in any.
It's just a niet.
Yes. And that is, I can tell you, there is a general consensus in Europe that this behavior is no longer going to be tolerated. The European Union is about rights and responsibilities. It's about taking advantage of the deep pockets of the donor states to support European economies. It also entails some obligations. So you can be humane, but you can also be rigid in terms of your migration policies, and that is what we'll try to do. We clearly stated that our policy regarding migration is different from the essentially non-policy of the previous government. For the first time, Greece has a policy. We told the Greek people that we want to change our asylum rules, that we want to have quick decisions. If you're entitled asylum, you have the right to stay here, and we have the capacity to integrate you in Greek society. But if you're not entitled asylum, we're going to send you back, because that's the only way you break the smugglers' trade.
Yeah.
So if people know that they will be sent back, they know they'll be wasting their money. If they're true refugees of war and persecution, of course,
take them.
But if they're just economic migrants, the answer is no. You cannot come.
Let me take quickly a couple of questions for the Prime Minister. Who has a question? Yes, I see a hand up there. If that's okay, Kyriakos.
Of course.
Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Inde and I'm a political strategist from France. I have a very simple question. So we talk a lot about reinventing democracy, and it implies that we are looking for young people to reinvent it. It's about the future of democracy. But the thing is, in France, but also in other countries, European or in the US, young people are very conservative. You know, they don't really, not all of them, but there are lots of them. They feel like, you know, human rights, women's rights and all of that is kind of an option, it's optional. So my question is for you, as a newly elected Prime Minister, how do you intend to integrate young people in their 20s and 30s in your politics, and how do you intend to make them want to be engaged in politics?
Yeah, maybe we can take a couple of questions, another question, and answer them together.
Okay, sure. I'll take one more question. That was about how to engage young people. Who else has a question for the Prime Minister? There's one at the back there.
Hi, my name is Aryan and I'm from Afghanistan. I was living in one of the squads by name of City Plaza in Athens, where the refugees had a safe place and we was managed as democratically. The first thing that you was elected, you closed the City Plaza. And me and other refugees, me and my family were in the streets after closing of City Plaza. So I would like to know what will be your government policy towards refugees, asylum seeker.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take both. Both questions.
So, back to refugees and engaging young
First of
people.
all, regarding refugees, we are providing as humane conditions as possible for everyone who is seeking asylum in this country. And we're really doing our best to do that. What I will not accept as Prime Minister is for refugees to be taken advantage by networks of illegal activities, to be placed in buildings that are under occupation. And we will always move refugees.
What do you mean by buildings under occupation?
Well, we had examples, for example, in areas of Athens where you had buildings which were taken over by anarchists, where the police never intervened, where they also had refugees living in horrible conditions. So we said, no, we're going to move you from here into appropriate, humane conditions. And what I will also do is I will make sure that asylum applications are processed in a timely manner, so that a final decision is taken as to whether someone is a refugee and is entitled status and protection according to international law, or if that is not the case. Because we have many people, for example, coming from Afghanistan who are subject of persecution. And I would argue, one should not forget that every single asylum case is individually judged. We're not making general statements. But there are also other cases where that is not the case, where we have people who are not entitled.
But a young woman like this who suddenly finds herself in the street, what do you say to her family?
What I say to her family is I'll be very interested to talk to her and see in which accommodation she can find herself. I don't know the details.
No, of course.
I don't know the details of the specific case, but what I can tell you is that this government is doing the best that it can, frequently against opposition from local communities and mayors, to take care of refugees in the best possible way. If there are mistakes, we're here to correct them. But I will not accept as Prime Minister of Greece that we're not spending significant resources to accommodate refugees in a humane manner. But I will also tell Greece that at some point this country cannot constantly live in a situation where we accept 500 or 1,000 people crossing the Aegean, seeking shelter and a better economic future. I will repeat what I said. If you're entitled to international protection, you will get it. And you will get it earlier than you did in the past. You won't be held hostage by a system. But if your goal is to come to Greece in search of a better economic future, I'm afraid we're not in a position as Greece to accommodate this. And I've been very clear in Parliament, very clear with the Greek people, and I think we have a very coherent and specific policy. As far as the second question, is concerned. Regarding youth engagement, the obvious answer is give more young people the opportunity to participate in politics. This is very much a decision we have taken at the party level. We have a very vibrant youth organization. I spoke at their Congress a few days ago. Very happy to see much more active participation in our youth organization. We included a lot of our youths in our party lists. A few of them were elected to parliament. And frankly, young people need to understand that engagement through the traditional means of politics, not just the sort of civic engagement that I encourage all youth to participate in, is also meaningful. You change the world by participating through the existing system, not only by protesting. Of course, the young people are always very participatory and engaging in civic problems. If I do have a concern, it's a general belief amongst many youngsters that nothing is going to change. All politicians are the same. But what is the alternative to that? Apathy is not the alternative. At the end of the day, representative democracy works because it gives the right to those who participate to make a decision about the future of their lives. If they don't want to, if they don't participate, then they will be left outside the decision-making process.
Kyriakos, thank you very much. We have to stop here.
Thank you very much.